Welcome to the Emporium Outdoors. My name is Michael, and today we're talking about the importance of a winch on an ATV or UTV. So for me, the most important equipment that you can add to an ATV or UTV is a winch. I would choose a winch before I would buy a spare belt, tools, or fuel. And I'll justify that by saying the most likely thing that's going to happen to you on a trail on a well-maintained machine is getting stuck or being trapped by downed trees or branches. The other three things are important, but you can mitigate some of those by inspecting your machine, making sure it's ready for the trail, making sure you've got fuel, inspecting the belt. But the thing that you can't plan for, especially if you're going out into the bush, is what's around the next corner. A trail one day could be different from the next just by a strong storm or a flood or something other. It can change the geographical area that you're in significantly just in 24 hours. So the most obvious thing you use a winch for is to pull your machine out of a mud hole, or if you're in a precarious position and you need to pull it up out of a steep gradient where you feel that you don't want to ride the machine up a steep slope, you can winch it. So there's two examples how a winch can make things safe, make sure you can get through where you need to get to. Another good use for a winch is to pull out down trees, even a big down tree, and you have a chainsaw. To move that big piece of trunk takes a lot of labor, or you can just use a winch. If you're a hunter, it's a great way to hoist game into trees so that you can deal with dressing them, for instance, rather than on the floor. A winch makes a perfect hoist to get that game up and off the ground. Another less obvious use of a winch that I've come across is during my winter travels, I'll often come across even smaller trees and branches that are in the way, and you would think, well, just pick them up and move them. But they are literally welded to the ground with the frost and ice, and there's no way you're going to get them off. You can spend time kind of trimming them all out and then ride over them. But if you can get a winch line under one section of it, you can normally hook it on and just rip that thing out. It's going to come out one way or another. So that's another really useful way to use a winch. And the other big benefit is if you're riding in a group where someone else doesn't have a winch, or you're the only person with a winch, you're always going to have friends, especially when they get stuck. So now I'm going to go over some of the basic stuff that I carry with me. Some of this stuff I don't carry with my ATV, but I carry it with my Jeep. And I'll show you a few items that you might want to consider carrying with your ATV, along with obviously the winch. So this is something called a soft shackle. This is made out of synthetic rope. It's stronger than steel, and it's very useful for using with something like this, which is a pulley. So the pulley will multiply your winch by a factor of almost 2. This pulley is actually designed for synthetic ropes, so it's nice and smooth so the rope can run through it. Like so, we just snug that up. And now we can run our winch rope around the pulley, and this will be locked to whatever we're winching to. So this is a really nice setup. I use this on my Jeep. This is a 41,000 pound pulley. You can get the traditional type of pulleys that are designed for steel cables, and I have used them on synthetic rope, but this is much more gentle, has a nicer radius for the rope, etc. So that's something I don't carry on this machine. This is more of a traditional type of shackle. You've probably seen these many times. Super cheap. I do carry one of these with the ATV. Instead of a traditional hook, you can also go with something called a flat link. So these are primarily used with softer cables. They're for much higher loads. This is 16,000 pound. And once they're locked into position, for instance, locked in like so, there is nothing that can slip out with a hook. You have a hook and a gate, and there's always a fear that the gate will fail, the rope will flip out. But with this, everything's more or less bolted together. So these are considered much safer. Personally, I find a hook more versatile, and I actually prefer a good quality hook. The other thing which is a nice to have but not a must is a remote. On my Jeep I have a remote, and it's very important because you can actually step away from the vehicle. If you are in a dangerous situation, a remote will take you out of that area of effect and allows you to kind of view what's going on and also adjust as accordingly. With an ATV, the controls are just here, so it's not as important. One of the most important things is having a strap. So you can hook the winch line directly to trees and such, but I strongly would advise against it. Any type of winch cable around a tree will damage the outside and injure the tree, which is unnecessary, but it's also maybe going to damage your winch line. So carrying a long strap like this, or tree strap, is very beneficial. This will spread the load around whatever you're pulling, and it's less likely to damage what you're pulling or to damage a tree, for instance. Personally, I don't like the shorter tree straps. I like something like this. It's about 20 feet long, and it gives me a couple of different options. So I can use this around the tree, so I can wrap it back and forth, ending with the tails towards obviously my machine so I can pull it. It's very quick to wrap it back and forth, so I can use up any slack that I need. Or if I'm kind of short, I've got 50 feet on this winch, I can actually extend out the winch, obviously by an extra 20 feet. Then I can just loop this over and that will attach to whatever. It's also great for just hooking around a log, and you can just tighten up around the log and you can pull that out of the way too. So these are consumables, I consider. These are very cheap. I think I bought this at Princess Auto for like $6 Canadian. And this 5/8 shackle, I think, was less than $5. So at your local hardware store, like say Princess Auto where I live, you can pick these up for cheap. And these are my two basic things that I always carry with me. These are the things that are great for the Jeep, but I don't feel I actually need it with a machine like this. So the winch I have fitted on this is a Champion 2,500 pound winch. The brands I prefer are Warn and Super Winch. Champion's okay if you're on a budget, but I prefer to have a Warn or, like I say, a Super Winch. They've always done really well for me. The size of the winch should be appropriate to your machine. On my Can-Am, which was maybe 2,000 pounds in weight, I had a 4,500 pound winch. On this one I have a 2,500 pounds, and this is probably a 500 pounds machine, so I've actually got a lot of pulling power on here. The rating on a winch is not what you expect. When the spool is full, the 2,500 pound capacity is actually less. The more line you have out, the stronger the winch becomes, because that spool acts like a gear, and the smaller the gear is, the less strain on the motor. And obviously the bigger, if you imagine a drum this big, you're trying to turn it, it's pulling a lot of line at one time. So smaller is more powerful than a bigger spool. So they do rate the winches at optimal performance. So there's a couple of wraps on the winch itself, something to be aware of. So there are two types of winch cable. There are steel and synthetic winch lines. Personally, I've always removed any steel lines that I've had on machines, or I just buy winches with only synthetic. I feel synthetic cables are the only way forward for three main reasons. One is I believe they're a lot safer. Steel cables will have tension and they will stretch under load, and they act like a spring. So if you have a weight on the end of a steel cable that's extended, especially extended a long way, and you get a stretch in the cable, if that thing breaks or comes unhooked, that's going to head back towards where it's being pulled from, and it can act as a pretty devastating weight, and it can hit things, hit people, kill people, damage machines. So something to be very aware of. Synthetic cables don't have the same type of energy stored in the cable. When they do snap, they tend to just fall to the ground. Doesn't mean to become complacent with having the same rules of not standing in line of the winch when you're pulling it, always stand away from it. You know, we don't want to take risks, and we don't want to differentiate between steel and synthetic and mix the two up one day and have that happen to you. So I always treat them equally. Secondly, synthetic cable is much easier to handle. It doesn't have little pieces of the steel that can come broken and can stick out as sharp pieces that if you're handling with both hands can be driven into your hand, or even with gloves if they're not strong leather gloves, They can sometimes punch your gloves and go into your hand. And if they get embedded, it can be a real pain. Also, synthetic cable doesn't get damaged by tight bends. So if you bend steel cable over a sharp edge, you're more likely to damage it. It's not good for either type of cable, but synthetic cable is more likely to be less damaged, as long as it's not a very sharp edge, because it obviously can cut it. But that's something else to bear in mind. Third benefit is they're obviously a lot lighter. Synthetic cable is much lighter than steel, and I know it doesn't sound like a lot, but if you can save a bit of weight on a machine, that's always nice, and it's much easier to handle a winch if you have to take it on and off when it has synthetic cable than it does with steel. And I'll add a fourth bonus one in there, and I wouldn't recommend this unless you're actually desperate, but if you do snap a cable, there are some fixes for steel cable, but you need specific types of clamps to refit a steel cable to actually tie two ends together, and that could be very cumbersome and you need tools. With a synthetic cable, you can tie the ends together and get yourself out of trouble if you need to, but it's something I have done in the past when I've snapped a cable and it did get me out of trouble. It's not recommended, and I replaced it straight away afterwards. So this quad actually came with a steel cable, and I've upgraded it to a synthetic cable. So let me show you how I did that right now. So I have a quick job to do. It's to replace the cable and the fur lead on the winch. So we're going to get straight into that. It's one of the better upgrades you can do for your ATV. The steel cables are really obsolete now, and I really dislike working with them. And the synthetic cables are relatively cheap and much safer. So let's get started. So I have my replacement winch cable, new fur lead, should fit. I also splashed out for a bump stop, which is a little big, but I think it'll be fine. So the winch cable attaches to the drum by a small hole that goes through, and it's held in place with a grub screw. To get the rope through the hole, I trim off some of the strands in order to make the rope a little bit narrower, and then just tape the edges and then push it on through. There we go. So I'm actually going to go past where I've cut. So I'm just going past where I've cut, and then we will put back in that set screw and then start winding it on. So the way I like to do it is I'll put in a couple of wraps and then I'll actually tape this back so it won't come out. somewhat unnecessary, but it just means you should make sure that that tag end will remain tucked the right direction. Once you've got the line on the drum, then it's always a good idea to actually unwind it again and then pull it in under tension. So just basically winch the machine back. That'll tension the rope itself and it will make sure it sits properly on the drum and it won't get caught between each of the different wraps itself. Next is this really big bumper. And that's it, we're all upgraded to synthetic rope, which is far stronger and safer to use. So I hope you've enjoyed the video and found it informative. If you do have any questions about winches or some of the equipment I've shown today, leave a comment below and I'll try and answer them the best I can. But until next time, take care. And as always, thank you very much for watching. If you like my videos, leave me a comment, maybe a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe.